It's probably appropriate that someone who teaches auto repair at GRCC would be asked to introduce a person who wrote a book titled Shop Class as Soulcraft, an inquiry into the value of work. He also wrote a book, The World Beyond Your Head, on becoming an individual in an age of distraction. I do know the first book, very appropriately, has been on the New York Times bestseller list, and I have my copy. I'm glad that I helped get it there. In The World Beyond Your Head, Matt Crawford investigates the challenge of mastering one's own mind with implications for the way we raise our children, design public spaces, and democracy itself. Matt Crawford attended Berkeley High and the University of California at Santa Barbara. He majored in physics, later earned a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Chicago, and he specialized in ancient political thought. Currently, he's a senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and also fabricates parts for custom motorcycles in Richmond, Virginia. I'm glad to introduce Matthew B. Crawford.
Thanks to Ben for that intro. I've always wanted to preach from a pulpit, and so this is my chance. I asked if I could get some clerical robes and maybe a pope hat for the occasion, but they haven't obliged me. So I want to talk about work, and in particular the kind of work that involves making things and fixing things, because I think that that kind of work has a wider cultural significance that's worth thinking about. And this is something that I started thinking about maybe 15 years ago when I noticed changes in material culture that were making it harder, I think, to be self-reliant, just harder, literally, to get a handle on your own stuff. There's a design philosophy that's emerged where the point seems to be to hide the works. So, for example, if you lift the hood on some cars now, what you're likely to see is something like this. Essentially, there's another hood under the hood, as though, I don't know, the sight of an alternator might offend us somehow. Some high-end cars now don't even have a dipstick, so you couldn't check your own oil level if you wanted to. Instead, you're sent an email from someplace when your oil level gets low. And I can't be the only person who's a little bit creeped out by that. Now, of course, it used to be that in addition to a dipstick, you had something called an idiot light. And it was called an idiot light for a reason. We had a harsh judgment of anyone who was so uninvolved with their own car that they let it get to the point that the light is coming on. But there's some weird cultural logic whereby idiocy, that is, a lack of involvement, gets recast as something desirable, right? It's a sign of technological progress. And of course, it is a kind of progress when you no longer have to mess around with dipsticks and dirty rags. But I also want to just notice that there is a kind of moral education that is tacit in material culture, and it can go in various directions. The way things are going currently, it often feels like the modern personality is getting reformed in the direction of passivity and dependence. There are just fewer occasions to be directly responsible for your own physical environment. And with that, I think, comes less expectation of responsibility. If you're over a certain age, and I think some of you are, you might remember that before there was the internet, there was something called the Sears catalog, and it had pretty much the same function. So the Sears catalog included these blown-up parts diagrams for all the appliances they sold, because it was just taken for granted that the consumer would demand this information. They, expected to own this for decades and wanted to know that parts were available and how it all went together. And by the way, raise your hand if you know what this is. Okay. I've shown this picture sometimes at university audiences and gotten a lot of blank stares. So So yeah, it's a wash. No, it's a sewing machine. Whereas now, let's say your washing machine goes on the fritz. Well, even if you are someone who's comfortable with basic stuff like motors and solenoids and relays, you might well feel daunted from taking on the repair yourself just because of the layers of electronic crap, frankly, that get piled on top of machines these days, often gratuitously. So, you can't learn to do everything. You have to pick your battles. And it might make more sense from the perspective of a narrow economic calculus to just get rid of the washing machine, send it to a landfill, even though it's probably just some $20 part that's gone bad. Now, you can criticize that decision from the perspective of environmentalism and sustainability, and I think that that's an important argument to make. But the argument I want to make is different. It's really about the effects on the individual. Because I think that kind of learned helplessness leaves us missing something that's really at the core of being human. And that is individual agency. By that, I just mean the experience of seeing a direct effect of your actions in the world and knowing that these actions are genuinely your own. And I want to highlight this idea because I think it's one of the kind of central features of modern life altogether, that we often feel like we're moving in these channels that have been kind of laid out for us from afar by vast impersonal forces that are very hard to understand. It might be globalization or collateralized debt obligations, these sort of forces in the world that no single person can really bring within view. Some of us worry that we're actually becoming stupider and wonder if getting a good grasp on the world intellectually may actually depend on getting a handle on it in some active and literal sense. I think that's why shop class in schools is important. That's why tinkering is important. These are ways that a young person begins to make his or her world intelligible. And on the other hand, if you don't feel that you can have an effect on the world, then I think you're not likely to feel responsible for it. And at that point, it kind of makes sense and becomes appealing to retreat into a virtual world where you're offered a kind of fantasy of agency and competence, right? So in playing video games, you blow stuff up and you get blown up, and then you just hit reset, and there are no real consequences to your actions. Unlike, say, wiring a house, where if you get it wrong enough, the house will burn down. So I want to begin by talking about work as it appears on TV, because I think that's a good way just into the just spirit of the times and to investigate where our collective heads are at. So there's all these shows about work. This Deadliest Catch, has anyone seen this? Ice Road Truckers. There's a whole slew of shows like this. And Deadliest Catch, it shows these commercial fishermen in the Bering Sea. And, on a good day, that basket would be full of fish, and it weighs, 1,000 pounds or something, and it's swinging around. There's often 30-foot seas. The deck is covered in ice. And it's the kind of work where if you lose your focus for even a few seconds, you can die. And in fact, people do die all the time. It's crazily dangerous work. There's another show, Dirty Jobs. It shows all kinds of grueling work. There was one episode that showed a guy who inseminates turkeys for a living. And I think the weird fascination that these shows have for us must lie partly in the fact that they're depicting these confrontations with material reality that have become exotically unfamiliar to us. Many of us do work that feels more surreal than real. So working in an office, it's often difficult to see any tangible results from your actions. What exactly have you accomplished at the end of any given day? The chain of cause and effect can become a bit opaque and confusing. And responsibility tends to get sort of spread around. And so that experience of individual agency can be a bit elusive in that environment. And speaking of Dwight from The Office, there's some great sociological literature on middle managers. And the picture that emerges in this literature is that they tend to feel quite insecure in their jobs. Think about it. If you're a carpenter, let's say, and you have a problem with your boss, you can say to him, "It's plumb, it's level, and it's square. Go check it yourself." But when you don't have appeal to concrete standards like that, it can be difficult to know where you stand. There's a lot of kind of walking on eggshells, and as it turns out, what you have to spend a lot of your time doing is managing what others think of you. The office can be a fairly paranoid place as compared to the job site. And I think that's one reason this show is so funny, is it really captures that quite well. And you could point to any number of other sort of pop culture items that are getting at something similar. I mean, there's Dilbert. There's this fantastic movie called Office Space. It's kind of a cult classic. It's very funny. So, I mean, the upshot is that it seems that quite a few people have come to regard their white-collar work with a kind of dark absurdism. And absurdism is great for comedy, but not so great as a way of life. So I think there are quite a few people wondering if there's some more real alternative, short of inseminating turkeys. And I think there is. I want to speak up for the skilled manual trades and suggest that that could be a life that's worth choosing. Now you might say, well, why does that even need to be said? I think it does need to be said because we've developed a kind of educational monoculture in this country where just about every kid gets pressured to go to a four-year university and get on a certain track where you end up working in an office. High school shop class programs were pretty widely dismantled in the 90s to make room for computer classes. And we had this idea then that somehow we're going to be gliding around in a pure information economy, and no one will have to actually do anything. But the truth is that some people, including some who are plenty smart, would rather be learning to build things or fix things. And why not honor that? Now, sometimes we do praise people who do that kind of work, but the praise often has a kind of edge to it. It seems to rest on an assumption that they had no other options. So we might idealize them as the salt of the earth and emphasize the sacrifice for others that their work might entail. And of course, that kind of sacrifice does indeed occur. So think, for example, of the hazards faced by a lineman restoring power during a storm. But what if that kind of work answers also to a basic human need of the one who does it? I take that to be the suggestion of this very nice poem by Marge Piercy, which ends with these lines: "The pitcher longs for water to carry, and a person for work that is real." So I wonder if beneath our gratitude to the lineman is something different, something more like envy. Here's a person doing something serious, something that it's possible to take seriously. And how many of us can say that? So I want to make a case for the trades based on a number of different kinds of considerations. I want to weave together arguments that I think, hang together in a loose kind of way. And just to put it all in front of you at the outset, it's going to go like this. I want to talk about the economic case for the skilled trades. I'll talk about the intrinsic satisfactions, because of course a paycheck is not the only thing that we want from work. Diversity of dispositions, by that I just mean that different people are suited for different kinds of work, and you're lucky if you find work that fits. Intellectual challenges, we don't often think of working with your hands as being intellectually challenging, but in fact, I really want to emphasize that point quite a bit. And finally, I'll speculate a little about manual competence and how it might be connected to moral education. So the economic case is fairly simple. There's, quite apart from the financial crisis we've been living through for the last few years, there are larger systemic changes in the economy. And a number of economists have been pointing out that the distinction that's emerging in the labor market is not the conventional one between those with more education versus those with less. Rather, it's between those whose service can be delivered over a wire versus those whose service has to be delivered on site or in person. And it's the latter who now find their jobs more secure against outsourcing to distant countries. So 30 odd years ago, we learned that anything that can be put in a box and then on a container ship is going to be made wherever labor is cheapest. And that's not here, that's China. Well, similarly, in the last 15 years or so, a very similar logic has emerged for the products of intellectual labor. So, for example, radiologists who examine images now find that they have to compete with radiologists in India who will work for much less. Something similar has happened to accountants and programmers. I once dealt with an editor of an American publication who turned out to be in the Philippines. But you can't fix a leaking toilet over the internet, and therein lies a certain kind of security for the plumber. So, if the goal is to earn a living, and of course, let me just say that of course earning a living is not the only point of education. It's to form the whole person. But insofar as the goal is to learn to make a living, maybe it simply isn't true that 18-year-olds need to be imparted with a sense of panic about going to university, getting into college. Though you certainly have to earn a lot post-high school to make a good living, but that can take a number of different forms. So, just let me tell you a little of my own story. I graduated in 1989 from UC Santa Barbara, and I moved down to LA to look for work in the aerospace industry. I had a degree in physics. And after about 5 months or so, I had sent out dozens of resumes and gotten essentially zero response. So I was out of money, and I found myself going around the parking lot of a home improvement store, putting flyers on the windshields of cars to advertise my services as an electrician. That's work that I had done all through high school and college, starting as a helper when I was 14. So the flyer said, "Unlicensed but careful." And it generated immediate response. There was more demand for my services as an unlicensed electrician than as a credentialed college graduate, so I went into business for myself doing that for a while, illegally. And in doing that work, I never stopped taking pleasure in this moment that would come at the end of the job, when I would flip the switch and the lights would come on. It was an experience of agency and competence. And the effects of my work were visible, just literally visible for all to see. So my competence had a kind of social reality to it. It wasn't just a private opinion I had of myself in my head. I was sometimes brought up short and made real quiet by a sight like this. So this is a big gang of conduit entering a panel. This is at a hospital in Detroit, actually. And look in particular at the bends in the upper right-hand corner that come around and down and up and over. This was a skill that was so far beyond my abilities that I felt like I was in the presence of some genius, and that whoever bent this conduit probably imagined this moment of recognition as he worked, that somebody would come along someday and appreciate it for what it is, which is, I think, a work of art. And by the way, the name of the guy who bent this conduit is Denny Kaye, and there he is with his pipe bender. So as a residential and light commercial electrician, most of my work got covered up inside of walls. But still, I felt pride in meeting the demands of a workmanlike installation. Maybe the wall would get opened up at some point by another electrician and he would see it, and I didn't want to be embarrassed at the thought of that moment. But even if not, I felt responsible to my better self, or rather to the thing itself. It's been said that craftsmanship consists simply in the desire to do something well for its own sake. So I think the main satisfaction is intrinsic to the work, and it's a kind of private experience in that way. But on the other hand, there's also a kind of self-disclosing that happens. And there's a guy who put this quite well. His name is Alexander Kojève. He said, "You recognize your own product in a world that's actually been transformed by your work. You recognize yourself in it. You discover and also reveal to others an objective reality that was at first just in your head." The satisfactions of manifesting oneself concretely in the world have been known to make a person quiet and easy. They seem to relieve him of the felt need to offer kind of chattering interpretations of himself to vindicate his worth. He can simply point. The building stands. The car now runs. The lights are on. He doesn't have much need for a sign like this one. Determined worker, intense, good worker, hard worker, terrific. The well-founded pride of the tradesperson is really quite different from not only the kind of anxiousness that Dwight captures so well, but also from the gratuitous self-esteem that educators are often told they have to impart to students, as though one could impart that by magic rather than through accomplishments. If you're an electrician, either you can bend conduit or you can't, and the fact is plain for all to see. And that means that you have some solid ground to stand on in your self-assessment. And it's the same ground on which others will assess you. So it means there's a certain psychic security, I think, that comes in doing work that has objective standards like that. I think some people get hustled off to university and then to the cubicle against their own inclinations and natural bents, when they might rather be learning to build things or fix things. There's a woodshop teacher named Doug Stowe who's written very eloquently about his work as a shop teacher. And he said, "In schools, we create artificial learning environments for our children that they know to be contrived and undeserving of their full attention and engagement. Without the opportunity to learn through the hands, the world remains abstract and distant, and the passions for learning will not be engaged." I don't think that's true of every student, but it's true of enough students that we ought to worry about it. A gifted young person who chooses, let's say, to become a mechanic rather than accumulate academic credentials, is viewed as eccentric, maybe even self-destructive. There's a pervasive anxiety among parents that there's only one track to success for their children, and it runs through a series of gates controlled by prestigious institutions. And of course, there's wide use of psychiatric drugs to medicate boys, in particular, against their natural bent toward action. The better to keep things on track, as the school nurse says. I'm picturing Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And this serves the interests of educators in preserving their own sanity. And I know that because I taught high school for a year. It was a complete disaster. And I would have loved to have had a Ritalin fogger in my classroom just for the sake of maintaining order. So I get, I understand the problem, but I think what that problem is that it's a rare person, male or female, who's naturally inclined to sit still for 16 years at school and then indefinitely at work. And yet this has become the one-size-fits-all norm in education, even as we go on about diversity in education. I don't think we do a very good job of accommodating the diversity of dispositions and the way people learn. Interestingly, things are very different in Germany. It's an interesting comparison to make. That's a place where a smart and ambitious 16-year-old might imagine him or herself becoming a prototype machinist at Mercedes-Benz. And that's a very respectable aspiration to have. And in fact, it's over half of 16-year-olds enter an apprenticeship program there. They just have a very different culture of work and education than we do. Here, apprenticeship is often criticized for being too narrow in education. It's often said that what the economy demands is workers who are flexible, almost that they shouldn't be burdened with any particular set of skills or knowledge, but just sort of eternally open to being reinventing themselves. But it bears thinking about that when you go deep into some particular skill or art, it trains your powers of concentration and perception. You become more discerning about these particular objects, whatever they may be. And if all goes well, I think you get initiated into an ethic of caring about what you're doing. Usually that's by the example of some particular person, some mentor, who embodies that spirit of craftsmanship, which is to care about what you're doing. So what I'm trying to say then is that technical training, though it's certainly narrow in its immediate application, can be understood as part of education in the broadest sense. That is, intellectual and moral formation. I think the trades suffer from low prestige, and that this is based in part on a simple mistake. Because the work is dirty, many people assume it's also stupid. We've developed a dichotomy of knowledge work versus manual work, as though these are two very different things. But that's a distinction that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Say you're trying to diagnose why a car doesn't idle properly. It's not a trivial problem. And more broadly, I think the kind of thinking that goes on in the various trades can be genuinely impressive, but only if we stop to notice it. And on the other hand, I think we sometimes romanticize white-collar work by presuming that it has more intellectual content than it may actually turn out to have. There's a lot of white-collar work gets dumbed down. There's such a thing as the electronic sweatshop, which can be every bit as stultifying as the assembly line. And I've had a couple of jobs like that I'd be happy to describe later if we have time. But by contrast, what a plumber or an electrician or an auto mechanic does is fundamentally different from the assembly line. It can never be reduced to simply following a set of procedures. The physical circumstances in which you do those jobs varies too much for it to be reduced to just following a recipe. It always requires improvisation and adaptability. And as a result, you feel like a human being, not a cog in a machine. Now, obviously, there's a huge variety of different kinds of work that take place in an office, and some of it is much, much better than others. And I've had some of the lousier office jobs, and I'm sure that colors my perception of these things, and I'm aware of that. So I think really the important distinction here is not between working with your hands or working in an office. Rather, the question is, does the job involve using your own judgment or not? But it's on precisely those grounds that I think the trades are worth taking a fresh look at. They're not for everybody, but they can be a good life for someone who wants to use his or her mind at work. And I count myself in that category, so let me say a little bit about the intellectual challenges of the work I do. So I have a small business. It's actually shifted from repairing bikes to fabricating parts for custom bikes, but I'm going to talk mostly about repair tonight. So it's in Richmond, Virginia. My shop used to be in this building long ago. And that's also the cover of my book, obviously. So I work on, it's mostly Japanese and European bikes, occasionally British bikes, and these are most often ones that have some vintage cachet that makes people willing to spend money on them, which of course is the whole point for me. And my decision to go into this line of work, it was a choice that seemed to perplex some of my acquaintances. And that's probably because my previous job was as director of a think tank in Washington. So I quit that job to go into business fixing bikes, and it made for some awkward moments at cocktail parties because people ask, "What do you do?" And I'd say, "I fix motorcycles." And there'd often be this moment of silence that would follow, an embarrassed silence. And I think what made it awkward is that in saying I fix motorcycles, I would be feeling pride in saying that, and the other person would be feeling like, oh, that's too bad. So it's kind of our two worlds just didn't line up at all. So let me try to explain the appeal. In fixing motorcycles, you come up with several imagined trains of cause and effect to try to account for whatever symptoms are presenting themselves to you. And you try to judge how likely these different scenarios are before you go tearing down the motor or whatever it is. And this imagining relies on a kind of mental library that you develop. An internal combustion engine can work in any number of different ways, and different manufacturers have tried different approaches. Each has its own ways of going bad, failing. So here's one that failed pretty spectacularly. This is essentially a pile of shrapnel in the bottom of the crankcase of a Ducati bevel drive motor from the 70s. And here's the motor put back together later. It's actually a really good-looking motor, I think. You also develop a library of sounds and smells and feels. So, for example, a backfire that's caused by an ignition problem sounds slightly different from a backfire that's caused by an air-fuel mixture that's too lean. And you can start to begin to tell the difference. As in any learned profession, you just have to know a lot. And if the bike is, let's say, 35 years old from some obscure maker that went out of business 25 years ago, like this thing, this is a Spanish bike called a Mototrans. In cases like that, it's the tendencies of the bike are known mostly through a kind of lore. I think it'd probably be impossible to do this kind of work in isolation. You have to be kind of tied into this community of mechanic antiquarians and have access to their collective historical memory. And these are relationships that are maintained by telephone, I find, even in the internet age. My most reliable source is a guy named Fred Cousins in Chicago. And the problem is he has such an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure European bikes that all I'm really able to offer him in exchange is the occasional delivery of obscure European beer. But so far, at least, it's worked out for me. Some diagnostic situations have a lot of variables in them. And on top of that, any given symptom can have several possible causes. And not only that, but those causes can interact with one another and be very difficult to isolate. So in trying to decide how to go forward, there often comes a point where the service manual is of no help because the theory is not, especially with older stuff, the theory kind of breaks down. You just have to step back, have a cigarette, walk around the lift, talk to other people. And it's in those episodes where the sort of gap between theory and practice opens up. That's where it gets interesting. And you find that you need the kind of judgment that really only comes from experience. It's more following hunches than following rules. So for me, at least, there's more real thinking going on in the bike shop than there was at the think tank. And the think tank job sometimes required that I reason backwards from some desired conclusion to a suitable premise. It was a policy place, and like any such place, it had taken certain positions. And that meant that there were some facts that we were more fond of, let's say, than other facts. So as its figurehead, I found myself making arguments that I didn't fully buy myself. And that was demoralizing. I felt like I was putting my tongue in the service of something I couldn't really stand behind. And to make it worse, my boss seemed intent on retraining me according to a certain cognitive style, I'll call it. It was that of the world of corporate lobbying, which he had recently come from. And this style demanded that I project an image of rationality. That was very important. But not indulge too much in actual reasoning, because it could sort of wander off in the wrong direction, could get in trouble. By contrast, in fixing bikes, you answer to standards that really aren't open to manipulation in that way. Either the bike starts and it runs right, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, there's no weaseling your way out of the fact. So you might say the BS quotient is small, and I like that about it. Unless you're working on Harleys, and then Harley owners, then the BS quotient can be pretty high. People ask why I don't work on Harley. Sorry, Ben. Ben rides a Harley. And I say I work on motorcycles, not lifestyles. You need a different kind of professional, not competent with the do-rag and the chaps. What is it with the chaps? I mean, there's an obvious answer, but I don't think it would be very welcome. Okay. I might have to sneak out the back door here. So mechanical work requires that you cultivate certain intellectual habits. And habits of mind have an ethical dimension that we don't often think about. Good diagnosis requires attentiveness to the machine, almost a conversation with it. And that's very different from the kind of assertiveness that you need in producing a position paper for a policy think tank. The cognitive psychologists speak of metacognition, which is the activity of stepping back and thinking about your own thinking. is what you do when you stop for a moment in your pursuit of a solution and wonder if your understanding of the problem is adequate. So, for example, the slap of worn-out pistons hitting their cylinders can sometimes sound quite a bit, surprisingly, like loose valve tappets. So to be a good mechanic, you have to be constantly open to the possibility that you may be mistaken. And that's a virtue that is at once cognitive and moral. It seems to develop because the mechanic, if he's the sort who goes on to become good at it, internalizes the sort of healthy functioning of the motorcycle as an object of passionate concern. I don't know how else you can explain the elation that you feel when you get to the bottom of some diagnostic problem. There are times when I'll just run over and kick the garbage can just out of joy, really, when I crack some nut. This active concern for the motorcycle, in this case, is reinforced by the social aspects of the job, what I'm calling social embeddedness. Like many independent mechanics, my business is based entirely on word of mouth. I sometimes barter services with machinists and metal fabricators. And that has a very different feel than transactions with money. It makes me feel like I really am part of the community. And one result of that is that I really don't want to screw up anyone's bike or charge more than a fair price, because people really do talk, and your reputation is everything. Now, you often hear people complain about mechanics and other people in the trades whom they take to be dishonest or incompetent, and I'm sure this is sometimes justified. But it's also true that the mechanic deals with a large element of chance, and that might be hard to appreciate if you've never done that kind of work before. I once dropped a feeler gauge down into the crankcase of a Kawasaki Ninja that was practically brand new. It was doing its first scheduled valve adjustment. So this was a disaster. And on this occasion, I escaped having to do a complete teardown of the motor through an operation that involved the use of a stethoscope. And when I finally laid my hands on that feeler gauge, I felt like I had escaped death. I don't remember ever feeling so alive as in the hours that followed. It was the kind of concentration that we associate with a bomb squad. But often as not, that kind of crisis does not end in redemption. Moments of elation are counterbalanced with failures, and these two are vivid. They take right in front of your eyes. It's not like, being a mortgage broker where you write a bad loan and 5 years later somebody loses their house in some other state. It's the consequences of your actions are quite immediate. One time, my shopmate forgot to tighten the pinch bolts holding the axle on the forks of a bike, the front wheel, and the guy got a few blocks away and came back complaining of a shaking in the front end. And nobody got hurt on this occasion, but that's the kind of episode that tends to focus the mind, let's say. So with stakes that are often high and immediate, I think the manual trades in general elicit a kind of heedful absorption in your work. They're punctuated by moments of pleasure that take place against a darker backdrop, which is this keen awareness of catastrophe as this possibility that's always just hovering right over your shoulder. The core experience, then, is one of individual responsibility, and this tends to get cashed out in face-to-face interactions between a tradesperson and his or her customer. So by way of concluding, I think a good job is one where you can put your best capacities to work and see a direct effect in the world. And educators who want to steer students toward work that has the kind of cognitive and social richness that I've tried to describe could do that in part by rehabilitating the trades. Now, to do that would take courage. Any high school principal who doesn't at least claim as his or her goal 100% university attendance is likely to be accused of harboring low expectations and run out of town by indignant parents. And that indignation is hard to stand against because it carries all the moral weight of egalitarianism. But of course, it's also snobbish insofar as it regards the trades as a low expectation. So the thought I want to leave you with is that I think the best sort of democratic education would be neither snobbish nor egalitarian. Rather, it would take its bearings from whatever is best. And at this weird moment of growing passivity and dependence, why don't we publicly recognize what's really a kind of democratic aristocracy among us? I mean, people who acquire real knowledge of real things, the kind that we all depend on every day. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions. There's a couple of microphones up here, or objections, refutations.
Okay, so we have 2 mics up here, so just step up if you'd like to ask a question.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you for the drawing of the VW pen in your book.
Yeah.
Just today, I was offered an opportunity to put forth a proposal to a board to start an alternative to Turner High School. How would you go about finding the right resources to do something like you're talking about?
I mean, to start a school? Man, I don't have the first idea, really.
Because they told me I have a blank slate to start a school in this town.
Wow. That's a rare opportunity.
And so how does one do that with the trades and the...
Yeah, it seems like...
What you're saying, I mean, we have the principal that'll do it. So you're saying it's hard to find the principal. I have the principal. So how do I find the resource?
You know, you're in Michigan, and in Michigan is Detroit. This is maybe just sound obvious, but it seems to me the whole apprenticeship model that's so successful in Germany, I mean, they just have the powerhouse manufacturing economy of Europe, that really ought to be looked at and embraced by American manufacturing. I'm thinking of the auto industry. Now, you know, to actually get them to, these are huge bureaucracies, so I don't know how you go about doing that. But at least there are very sound and powerful arguments for why they ought to support technical training at every level. I mean, in Germany, it's, you know, from high school up. It seems like involving industry is, I mean, there's a huge pile of money there. How you go about doing that is you need someone more skilled in the ways of the world than I, but I wish you luck. Yeah. Say it again. Have been taught learned helplessness? I guess historically that's right. That's one of the kind of beefs of the early feminists, that there is a kind of learned helplessness. But on the other hand, I mean, back when home ec, you know, which is like the counterpart to shop class, I mean, those were real skills that people were learning. I mean, learning to sew and make your own clothes and stuff like that. I think everything I've said up here, my examples have, tended to be male, just because I'm writing about what I know about. But I think the same arguments apply completely to women as well. Just the satisfaction of seeing, taking your own world in hand and being responsible for your physical environment. I think we've all been kind of trained into learned helplessness by the way we understand technology. We view it as magic, as magical forces. It's interesting, whenever I hear the word technology, I just translate and I say magic, because you wouldn't use that word if you actually understood what you're talking about. It's, you talk about diodes or resistors or, whatever the particular things are. So it's a mindset, it's a kind of ideology of magic that makes us passive and dependent. And I see it as kind of really applying to, I guess I don't see that aspect as being highly gendered, but kind of something we're all afflicted with.
I couldn't help but think about the trend now for makerspaces.
Uh-huh.
And that, while it's not in a formal educational setting so much as we see it popping up in libraries and in towns and maker fairs,
Yeah.
that might be hearkening to a recognition of
Yeah.
the impact of doing things and sharing things and learning things together.
Yeah, I think there's a hunger for that, and this maker space and whole do-it-yourself thing that's really kind of risen in the last 10 years as a response to that. I think partly it's that people in their work lives often feel like that experience of individual agency is hard to come by, and so they come home and they have their hobbies, or they so, it's an understandable kind of compensation, I guess. My argument is really about the kind of work that you could actually make a living at. So you'll notice I haven't talked about artsy, craftsy stuff like basket weaving or whatever it may be. Those things are great, but I wanted to restrict my case to trades where you can reliably secure a middle-class life for yourself. I mean, no one's going to, let me put it this way, very few people are going to make a living as guitar makers. I mean, you have to really get lucky. But on the other hand, there's a lot of demand for, say, diesel mechanics. And as grubby and as unattractive as that image might be of the diesel mechanic, I'm trying to kind of break that down a little bit and report from the inside what the experience is actually like to work on machines, and say that it can be pretty great. So, and the makerspace, I mean, part of that is that, and this is neat, that with 3D printing and all that, suddenly making is sexy because it's digital. So I think sort of we're coming back to making stuff through the back door of the digital, which is turning a lot of people on to just the idea of making. Like, we sort of forgot that you can do that, and people are rediscovering it, so that's great. I also think there's, sort of mass employment in manufacturing is definitely a thing of the past in the global economy, because we can't compete with the low wages of overseas. But it's also true that sort of small batch specialty manufacturing there's a lot of opportunity in that for people who are able to combine kind of computer skills with some of the more traditional things like machining. It's not, there's a lot of sort of little niches in the economy where that are really encouraging, I think. I tell the story in my new book of this shop that builds pipe organs, Baroque pipe organs in Virginia. And these are, like this size, like they go in churches and stuff. And, they might cost $2 million a piece. And they've inherited this, several hundred-year-old tradition of organ making, and they're learning from this tradition. They're also integrating it with computer-aided design and stuff. They're basically trying to make the best organs they possibly can. And it's a really fascinating interplay of this spirit of kind of loving antiquarianism with the cutting-edge innovation. And it really, the people who work there seem to understand their own progress as organ makers within this larger historical arc. Where they're actually, believe it or not, building their organs to still be in service 400 years from now. That's the kind of time frame that they're thinking in. And so it's just very interesting how their deep involvement with the past, with the organ makers of the past, puts them in this trajectory that carries them so far into the future. It's really a beautiful story, I think. Maybe one more if anyone's feeling bold. Here's one over here. Yeah, boy, it's hard to imagine 3D printing on a scale of, of making buildings, but where you do see some interesting developments is in 3D templating, which is, well, there's a couple. One thing you can use it for is to basically make a scan of a 3D object. I'm interested in learning this myself because you could, for example, I want to transplant the engine and transmission from a modern Subaru into an old air-cooled Volkswagen. So to design all the bracketry to make that happen is very time-consuming, but if you have a 3D scan of the Subaru stuff and of the VW stuff, then you can enter that into CAD and design around it. What I'm trying to get at is it's very hard to make measurements of 3D objects, and this does that for you. So there's that, but in the construction world, there's now sort of, the CAD has gotten to the point where you can zoom in and kind of really inhabit, almost like walk around the building and solve sort of conflicts in the design, before you get to the actual construction phase. I'm not doing this justice because I've only have a little familiarity with it. But thus far, 3D printing is good for making trinkets and, it's plastic, basically. The next stage is that they can use it to make molds, which you can then cast metal into and get something that's actually, useful in a real-world environment. So who knows where it's going to go, but it's definitely interesting. Any other, maybe one more? Yeah.
The early philosophers used a lot of terms that are from the trades, and I kind of wonder, the changes in philosophy, and you talked about education, how it got away from the trades. Now, the community colleges offer a lot of courses in the trades these days, and you hear presidents talking about the trades, some, the governors. What do you think about the future in our country as far as philosophy, education, maybe heading towards the German model, more apprentices with those intersections?
Yeah. I don't know if everyone heard the question, but I'll try to reproduce it. But toward the end, you were asking, what about the German model, and are there any prospects for it being adopted in the States? I think one real obstacle is that it requires a kind of far-sightedness on the part of industry to support the training of the next generation of people they're going to need. And the problem is that capital has a very short time window. It used to be that the average time someone owned a stock was, I don't know, I'm going to make this up, but 15 years, let's say. And now it's like 3 years or something very short. So you know, the managers of the company, they're very concerned with a short-term stock price. And of course, their own compensation is tied to, you know, getting the stock price up. And what that means is the kind of long-term investment in training, apprenticeship, it just, it's a hard sell. And it would require a real kind of cultural shift, I think. So that's, you know, that's a pessimistic note to end on. I do think that there is a shift kind of evident in the culture where at least people now are seeing that these things are important for the middle class, and that education needs to serve you know, the middle class, and it used to be the case that going to a four-year university secured you a kind of ticket into that world, but it's no longer the case. So if any, you know, the Great Recession, as they're calling it, if it has any kind of silver lining, I think one is that it's given us pause, and the question of what good work looks like is a little more open now than it has been for a while. People are willing to rethink these things. So that's encouraging. So thanks very much for coming to listen, and good night.